3 weeks before my 24th anniversary at Helix Industrial Systems. I was called into the glass conference room on the 12th floor so they could quietly turn me into someone invisible. That moment still lingers in my mind. But first, I'm curious to know where you're hearing this from today and what the temperature is where you are right now. And if stories like this resonate with you, consider subscribing, because every subscription helps spread that value to others. My name is Erla Moore. I'm 52 years old, and for nearly a quarter of a century, I've been the senior industrial systems engineer responsible for keeping some of the most expensive manufacturing lines in the Midwest alive. If a robotic press line went down at 3 in the morning, my phone rang. If a calibration drift threatened a production run worth millions, I was the one standing on the factory floor figuring out why. If Helix kept a contract with one of our largest automotive clients, chances were high it was because I'd fixed something nobody else could. That reputation was exactly why the meeting felt strange the moment I walked in. Across the table sat Melissa Grant, head of HR. Next to her was the man who had arrived 18 months earlier and decided the company needed modern leadership, Adrian Keller, 37 years old, former strategy consultant, famous internally for long presentations about cost optimization, organizational restructuring, and what he liked to call modernizing legacy systems. Adrian had probably spent thousands of hours explaining factories on PowerPoint slides, but he had never stood next to a stamping press worth $20 million when it suddenly went silent during a live production shift. Melissa slid a printed document across the table. Updated job description. I looked down. Vendor reporting, workflow documentation, internal analysis. Nothing about system diagnostics. Nothing about emergency troubleshooting. Nothing about production recovery, the work I had actually done for 24 years. Adrian folded his arms. From now on, we'd like you to stay within these parameters. I read the paper again. Then I folded it carefully and placed it on the table. Understood, I said quietly. Adrian nodded. Satisfied. He believed he had just solved a staffing problem. What Adrian Keller didn't understand was this: 24 years of experience doesn't disappear when someone edits a document. It simply starts looking for somewhere else to create value. The next part of this story blends elements of fiction with creative storytelling tools, including artificial intelligence, to explore real-world ideas and emotional truths. Thank you for being here and listening. And if today isn't the right moment to continue, that's completely okay. Take a breath, step away for a while, and take care of yourself. On Monday morning, I did exactly what the new job description told me to do: nothing more, nothing less. I opened my laptop, pulled up the document HR had handed me, and started working line by line: vendor reporting, workflow documentation, internal process analysis. I wrote detailed reports about supplier response times. I mapped production workflows in neat diagrams. I drafted pages of documentation that looked impressive and meant almost nothing to someone trying to restart a broken factory line. For 24 years, my real job had been solving problems in real time, usually while standing beside machines worth millions of dollars. Now, according to Helix, my role was paperwork. 3 days later, the first crack appeared. The call came from Iron Gate Automotive, Helix's largest client. Their robotic assembly line had lost synchronization, and production was slowing down by the minute. In the past, they would call me directly, and within 10 minutes, we would usually isolate the fault. I already knew the sound of that system in my head. This time, I listened quietly as the operations manager explained the problem. Then I answered in the calmest voice I could manage. Please contact Customer Solutions. My role no longer includes technical support. The silence on the line lasted several seconds. By the afternoon, the news had spread through the entire building. The vice president of sales called first, then the chief operating officer. Finally, Adrian himself. Every conversation ended the same way. Just help them. They said. My answer never changed. Update the job description. The pressure from Helix didn't explode all at once. It arrived quietly. One small change at a time, like someone slowly turning down the lights in a room and pretending nothing had changed. By the following week, I noticed my calendar invitations had stopped. Meetings I had run for years, technical reviews, production recovery briefings, emergency diagnostics calls continued without me. My access to two internal monitoring dashboards suddenly required temporary authorization. When I asked IT about it, the response was polite and vague routine security adjustment. A day later, HR scheduled a formal performance review. Even though my last evaluation had been less than 3 months earlier, none of it was loud. But the pattern was obvious. They were building a file. Anyone who has worked long enough inside a corporation recognizes that process. First, you isolate the employee, then you limit visibility, then you question performance. Eventually, the documentation says the departure was inevitable. What Adrian Keller didn't realize was that 24 years of experience teaches you how these games are played. I had seen restructurings before. I had watched managers quietly erase people from the map until they disappeared from the payroll. So I started doing something they didn't expect. I documented everything. Every email went into a separate archive folder. Every phone call was logged with the date and summary. I saved the job description I had been hired under years earlier and placed it next to the new one Melissa had slid across the conference table. The difference between those two documents told a story no corporate memo could rewrite. The original role described a senior engineer responsible for production continuity and technical crisis management. The new one described an analyst who wrote reports about workflow. The distance between those descriptions was the distance between what Helix claimed I did and what I had actually been doing for decades. And that gap mattered, because if they eventually pushed me out, those records would show exactly how valuable that invisible work had been. Isolation can make people shrink. For me, it did something else. It made the next decision clearer. 2 weeks passed after the quiet isolation began, and the tension that had been building finally found its moment. Early Tuesday morning, my phone vibrated on the kitchen counter while I was pouring coffee. The caller ID showed a number I knew immediately: Iron Gate Automotive. They were Helix's largest manufacturing client, and their robotic stamping facility produced components for multiple automotive plants across the Midwest. When something went wrong there, the consequences traveled quickly through the entire supply chain. I answered the call and heard the strained voice of Marcus Delaney, Iron Gate's operations director. Marcus had worked with me for nearly a decade, and he rarely sounded uncertain. That morning, he did. 2 of their robotic stamping lines had stopped within minutes of each other. The synchronization system that coordinated the press timing had begun throwing inconsistent signals, causing the machines to halt as a safety precaution. Production had already been down for several hours. According to Marcus, the financial loss was approaching $2.3 million per day. Helix's technical team had been on the issue all night. They had run diagnostics, checked the calibration sensors, and restarted the control software twice. Nothing worked. The system continued to drift out of synchronization. I could hear machines idling in the background and the distant echo of the factory floor. Normally, in situations like this, I would already be halfway through isolating the fault. Marcus lowered his voice. "I'm not calling Helix," he said quietly. "I'm calling you." For a few seconds, I said nothing. The silence stretched longer than either of us expected. I understood the problem he was facing, but I also understood the document Adrian Keller had placed in front of me 2 weeks earlier. Finally, I answered, choosing each word carefully. "I can't help as an employee." Marcus didn't respond immediately. The line stayed quiet, filled only with the hum of distant machinery. Then, I added the sentence that changed everything. "But tomorrow, I start personal leave. If you agree with my decision to follow their job description exactly and step back from fixing Iron Gate's crisis, leave a 1 in the comments, because your voice here matters more than you might think." Marcus was the first one to speak again after that long silence. His voice was lower now, more careful, as if he understood the line we were both standing on. "If you came in as an independent consultant," he asked, "what would it cost?" The question hung in the air longer than I expected. For a moment, I didn't answer. I had spent 24 years solving problems for companies like Irongate, but I had never once placed a direct price on what that knowledge was worth. My entire career had existed inside salaries, performance reviews, and polite corporate language that always avoided the real value of the work. Now Marcus was asking for a number. A real one. I walked over to the kitchen window and looked out at the quiet street while I thought about it. My mortgage payment, my daughter's tuition. The way Adrian Keller had folded his arms across that conference table and told me to stay inside the parameters of a document that erased half my career. Fear crept in first. The kind that whispers you might be making a mistake that cannot be undone. But underneath that fear was something steadier. For 2 decades, I had been the person companies called when the machines stopped and the losses started climbing by the minute. I knew exactly how rare that kind of experience was. Even if Helix had decided it didn't matter anymore, I went back to the phone. Emergency stabilization for the 2 lines. I said slowly, $45,000. Marcus didn't interrupt. So I continued. Full system diagnostics and permanent correction plan for the synchronization issue. 25,000. Another silence followed. Shorter this time. Marcus told me he needed to speak with their legal team. The line went dead, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the sound of my own breathing. 20 minutes later, the phone rang again. Marcus didn't waste time with small talk. Our legal team reviewed the Helix service contract. He said, then he delivered the sentence that changed everything. The contract allows it. The next morning began earlier than usual, but my mind was already clear. By 6:30 a.m., I was walking through the main entrance of the Irongate Automotive Facility, helmet in hand, and a temporary contractor badge clipped to my jacket. The factory floor sounded different from the moment I stepped inside. Machines have rhythms, and when something is wrong, the rhythm changes. It is subtle, but once you learn it, you never forget it. Marcus met me near the control station. He looked like someone who had been awake for most of the night. Production supervisors and technicians stood nearby, watching quietly. They had already run every diagnostic test the system could generate. According to the reports, nothing obvious was wrong. I asked them to show me everything they had already checked: sensor arrays, hydraulic pressure readings, calibration logs, synchronization software, on paper. Every system looked stable, but the machines themselves told a slightly different story. One robotic press was cycling a fraction of a second out of rhythm with the others. Not enough to trigger a fault immediately, but enough to confuse the timing logic that kept the entire line synchronized. I followed the signal chain backward through the control cabinet. 12 minutes after arriving, I found the source. A timing relay inside the synchronization module had begun drifting outside its tolerance range. It was a tiny component, something most people would overlook during routine diagnostics. Yet that small deviation had slowly pushed the entire robotic line out of alignment. It's the relay, I told Marcus, pointing to the unit. Replace this one and recalibrate the synchronization loop. The maintenance team swapped the part within an hour, after the system rebooted. The presses began moving again slowly at first. Then, with the steady rhythm, I remembered. By late afternoon, both production lines were operating normally. Marcus stood beside me on the floor and watched the machines run. How long would it have taken anyone else to find that, he asked quietly. I didn't answer. Some knowledge lives in manuals. The rest lives in experience. The shift in power began quietly. But once it started, it moved faster than anyone at Helix expected. By the morning after Irongate's production lines were running again, word had already reached my old office. Someone had recognized my name on the temporary contractor badge. Someone else had reported that the synchronization failure had been solved less than an hour after I arrived. It did not take long for the message to travel upward through Helix's management chain. My phone rang before noon. Adrian Keller's name appeared on the screen. I answered calmly. You're interfering with our client relationship, he said immediately, skipping any greeting. His voice carried the tight control of someone trying to contain a problem that had already started slipping beyond his reach. I leaned back in the chair at the small consulting desk Irongate had given me for the day. I'm on personal leave, I replied. The pause that followed was brief but heavy. Adrian knew the policy as well as I did. Personal leave meant I was not acting as a Helix employee. It also meant that anything I chose to do outside the company was not covered by the same restrictions he was trying to enforce. You're creating a conflict, he insisted. No, I said evenly. I'm honoring the job description you gave me. The call ended soon after that. Adrian had nothing else to argue with. The document he had used to limit my role had become the shield that allowed me to step outside it. 2 days later, the situation escalated further. Irongate's procurement department sent Helix a formal notice stating they were reviewing alternative technical support providers for future projects. The message was professional, but the implication was unmistakable. Irongate had just reminded Helix that their relationship depended on expertise, not paperwork. Inside Helix, the reaction was immediate. Managers who had barely spoken to me in months suddenly began leaving messages. Emails arrived asking to clarify circumstances. One director even asked if I would be willing to discuss re-establishing cooperation. For the first time since that meeting in the glass conference room, the pressure was no longer moving toward me. It was moving the other way. The negotiation began sooner than I expected. But by then, the situation had already changed. 2 days after Irongate notified Helix that they were reviewing alternative technical support providers, an email arrived from Adrian Keller requesting a formal discussion. The tone was noticeably different from our earlier conversations. The urgency was still there, but the certainty was gone. The first offer came later that afternoon. Helix proposed a consulting agreement worth $90,000 annually, asking me to provide occasional technical advice when their internal teams encountered complex equipment failures. On the surface, it sounded reasonable, but the structure made the intention clear. They wanted access to my expertise while keeping the arrangement safely under their control. I read the document carefully, then closed the file and wrote a short reply. No. Thank you. There was no anger in my response. By that point, I no longer needed to argue. Irongate's operations team had already informed Helix that a $140 million facility expansion was under evaluation. The success of that project depended on reliable technical support during installation and commissioning. Everyone involved understood that losing the Irongate account would cost Helix far more than any consulting contract they might offer me. 3 days later, a second proposal arrived. This one was very different. The agreement included an annual consulting retainer, a dedicated emergency response contract guaranteeing my availability for production failures, and formal oversight of several process optimization projects tied to the expansion. The structure acknowledged something Adrian had resisted earlier, that my work was no longer optional. I reviewed the document again and added a single clause before sending it back. If Helix were sold within the next 5 years, I would receive 5% equity as part of the transaction. Adrian pushed back immediately. The email exchange lasted 2 days, but then Irongate's procurement team contacted Helix again, requesting confirmation that I would remain involved in the upcoming expansion project. That message ended the discussion. Later that evening, Adrian returned the contract. This time, it carried his signature. When the signed contract arrived, I read it twice before allowing myself to believe it was real. The document looked ordinary corporate language, legal clauses, standard formatting, but the numbers told a very different story. For the first time in my career, the value of the work I had done quietly for decades was written clearly on a page. The breakdown was simple. The emergency repair that had restored Irongate's production lines was listed at $45,000. The full system diagnostics and synchronization redesign I completed afterward added another $25,000. The largest portion, however, came from the annual consulting retainer Helix had finally agreed to $200,000 for guaranteed availability during technical emergencies and oversight of the expansion project. Altogether, the total for the first year reached $270,000. For several minutes, I sat in my car outside the Iron Gate facility, holding the phone in one hand and the contract in the other. The late afternoon sun was reflecting off the factory windows, and inside the building, the production lines were moving with the steady rhythm I had helped restore. It felt strange to realize that the same knowledge Helix once tried to push aside had just become the most valuable thing in the entire negotiation. Eventually, I started the engine, but instead of driving home right away, I made one more call. My daughter answered after the second ring. She sounded distracted, probably studying again. Graduate school had been expensive, and for months she had been worrying about how she would finish paying the remaining tuition. "Hey, Dad," she said. "Everything okay?" I looked down at the contract on the passenger seat and smiled for the first time that day. "Better than okay." I told her, "Your tuition is covered." There was a pause on the line, the kind that happens when someone is trying to decide if they heard correctly. Then she laughed softly in disbelief. What happened? I leaned back in the seat and glanced once more at the numbers. I finally stopped doing 2 jobs for the price of one. A year passed before Adrian Keller asked to see me again. By then, the urgency that once filled his voice had faded into something quieter. We met at a small coffee shop not far from the Helix headquarters. The company had changed during that year. 2 major clients had moved their production contracts elsewhere after a series of technical failures Helix could not resolve quickly enough. Iron Gate, however, was still running smoothly, and I continued consulting for them under the agreement we had signed. Adrian looked older than I remembered. After a few minutes of polite conversation, he finally asked the question that had clearly been sitting with him for months. What did I do wrong? I considered the question carefully before answering. There was no anger left in me anymore. Only clarity. You tried to replace experience with a document, I said. He frowned slightly. So I continued. You thought a job description could capture 24 years of judgment, relationships, and instinct, but you can't automate that kind of knowledge. Adrian nodded slowly, absorbing the words without arguing. Outside the window behind him, the distant silhouette of Iron Gate's facility was visible against the afternoon sky. I knew the production lines inside were moving steadily, just as they had every day since the repair. And this time, the value of that work was no longer defined by Helix. Erla Moore decided it herself. There is something quiet but powerful about realizing your worth at the exact moment someone else tries to reduce it. What I learned through this experience wasn't only about contracts or money. It was about patience, dignity, and understanding that knowledge built over years cannot be erased by a piece of paper. Sometimes the strongest response isn't anger or revenge, it's the calm decision to let your work speak for itself. And when the moment comes, the truth reveals who really understood the value all along. I often wonder what you might have done if you were in my position. Would you have pushed back immediately, or chosen the quieter path I took? There's no single right answer, and that's what makes stories like this worth sharing, if you listened all the way to the end. Thank you. I truly appreciate your time. And if this story meant something to you, a small action from you can help it travel further. A comment, a like, or a simple subscription helps this message reach someone who might need to hear it today. Sometimes sharing a story is the first step in helping someone else see their own value more clearly. This story was fully created and produced by our team. We do not copy or borrow content from any other channel. Thank you for staying with us and listening until the end.